Greetings, everyone. My name is Ari Peralta, and again, it is a pleasure to do the lecture for our lesson, this time on chapter 7 of Second Corinthians. Our lesson is so insightful. It gives us actually the questions that we try to answer every week, really gives us a deeper understanding of what the Bible is saying. And it also allows us to reflect on what it means to us. And I'm sure throughout your group discussions, you have learned more insight. And of course, we also have an excellent commentary at the end of our lesson. And so I was wondering, what else can I contribute to this lecture of mine? As I was going through chapter 7 of Second Corinthians, the word downcast spoke to me. The word downcast has a meaning of being brought low because of grief or being depressed. And I think today this is very relevant because this speaks of our mental health, something that many are experiencing not so well today. In a news article by the Philippine Star, citing a 2017 World Health Report, the Philippines has one of the highest cases of depression in Southeast Asia, affecting more than 3 million Filipinos. Further, it says that 8 in every 100,000 Filipinos commit suicide. Wow, no, these are really staggering numbers, and this is pre-pandemic levels. One can only think that these numbers have increased after the pandemic. You see, this is the problem that we are not just facing, but perhaps we ourselves are experiencing. While we may not be clinically diagnosed as depressed, many of us are experiencing sorrows. And if not addressed, it can lead to depression. And if it is not us, then I'm sure we know of someone who is facing sorrow, or perhaps are hiding their sorrows, whether us or others. You see, for us Christians, there is this notion that we are immune or that we shouldn't be depressed anymore. I'm sure you have heard this advice or perhaps made this sort of advice that prayer lang katapat niyan. Or in English, all you need is to pray for it. No? Or perhaps we would even say, I prayed for you. You are already victorious in Christ. No, you shouldn't be depressed anymore. Usually the expectation is that we will be okay because we are Christians already. But those who have experienced sorrows can testify that it is not that easy. How they wish it is that easy, but in reality, it is not. It is no wonder that many are keeping this feeling of sorrow to themselves because even if they tell others, chances are people will just dismiss them. And so the result is that we put on a facade. On the outside, we may seem okay, but on the inside, our hearts cry. Now, this is especially true for our church leaders. Pastors and church workers are looked at by a different standard, of a higher standard. But like Paul, we are all humans. In our passage to say, we see Paul facing sorrow. Paul is a reminder that no one is exempt from depression. You see, scholar tells us that there were many times that Paul experienced depression. In his letter to the Corinthians, he says this himself, that he is one who is downcast. And who wouldn't be? I mean, look at what happened to him. He experienced illness, abandonment, and betrayal. Sounds familiar? Like do we experience those kind of things? And like Paul, we too become downcast. If Paul, a blessed apostle of Christ, one who had a supernatural encounter with Christ, can experience depression, then so can we. And so the question for us today is, what can we do then? In our passage today, Paul tells us how he was able to break through and find joy amidst being downcast. And so we can learn from Paul, whether it is us who are downcast or someone we know. And so, what does Paul say? Let me read to you verses 6 to 7 of our passage today. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the comfort you had given him. He told us about your longing for me, your deep sorrow, your ardent concern for me, so that my joy was greater than ever. This verses tells us that in times of sorrow, we need God, a friend, and a community. Let us talk about God. Paul tells us that first and foremost, God comforts the downcast. He makes a testimony of this in the earlier part of his letter in chapter 1, verses 3 to 11, of how God comforted him in all the afflictions that he faced, even death. And in verse 5 of our passage today, he makes another testimony of how God has comforted him as he faced no rest, harassment, conflicts, and fears. This tells us that God is present amidst the troubles we are facing. And what more, he delivers us. Just as God delivered Paul from his troubles, so will he do to us as well. God will deliver us from our troubles. God tells this to all who seek the Lord, and we see this in Isaiah 51. Let me read those to you. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were cut, and to the quarry from which you were hewn. The Lord will surely comfort Zion and will look with compassion on all her ruins. He will make her deserts like Eden, her wasteland like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the sound of singing. This tells us that God will rescue his people. This is God telling his people back then of how he will rescue them from their ruin, both physically and emotionally. And he does this with compassion. This was God's promise to his people back then. And in the coming of Christ, this age has arrived, not just to the Jews, but also to us, Gentiles. We are now reconciled with God, and we can find comfort in God. Just like in Isaiah, God turns our desert experience of being alone, lonely, afraid, ashamed, and helpless into joy and gladness. I think many can testify to this, of how God spoke to us in our desert experience, whether it was during our prayer time, our devotion, through our reading of the scripture, or in our contemplation. We can testify to how God has given us hope and brought us out of our ruin. Personally for me, I can remember the time when I was so down because of what was happening in my business. But as I did my quiet time back then, as I walked in the morning and I was just, contemplating on what is God telling me. God spoke to me at that time. By the time I finished my walk, I was comforted by God. God was telling me that I am in control. And I'm sure you also had that experience. Perhaps not in a different way, but I'm sure God has spoken to you in times of your trouble. And so we can trust God. And it is true that when what others say, that you can trust God because God comforts the downcast. Now, but while often we say this to others, it must not stop there because it doesn't stop just at God. We also have a role to play in this. You see, God doesn't just work in us supernaturally, nor console us in our personal walk with Him, but also through us, people, His people. We are His instrument upon which others will be comforted. This goes back to the message of reconciliation with God. Because we are now reconciled with God, we are being restored in God's image as His representative on earth. Thus, we are now God's instrument to bring comfort to the downcast. We see this in the life of Paul, where God consoled him first through Titus, his loyal friend, and with the community of Corinth. And so, just like Paul, we need a friend. For Paul, it was Titus. He is Paul's partner and fellow worker. They are like minded and consider him as his spiritual son. They were that close. In Titus, he had someone he can trust. He is trustworthy with the money that he was given the responsibility to collect funds in Corinth to help the troubled believers in Jerusalem. This is how much Paul trusted Titus. Titus is also one who won't abandon Paul. He can be relied on and knows that he would be there for him. That is why Titus was Paul's messenger and envoy to many cities. He knows that he would come back. If we look at it back then, no, there was no cell phone, there was no social media. And so one can easily vanish. One can easily go away and never be heard of if you are hiding from someone. With all the troubles that Christian evangelists like Titus was facing, he could have easily abandoned Paul and lived a less stressful life. It was easy for him to do that. But he didn't. He always returned to Paul and did not abandon him. Titus also eased the burden of Paul. After feeling betrayed by the Corinthians, one can imagine how hard it may have been for Paul to personally confront the Corinthians on what they have done to him. Logistically, it was already hard for Paul to return to Corinth, but emotionally, it made it even harder. Instead, it was Titus who confronted the Corinthians. He was the one tasked to send that tearful letter of Paul. Now, we can imagine that at that time, when Paul was anguishing over what has happened in Corinth, perhaps Titus said to Paul, "Don't worry about it. I got this. Let me help you. I'll be the one to confront them." This is how loyal of a friend Titus was to Paul. And it was not just in Corinth that Titus eased the burden of Paul. He was the one who helped Paul in Crete to put things in order after Paul had departed. We see this in Titus chapter 1, verse 5. You see, when Paul needed help, Titus was there for Paul. And so for us who are downcast, we all need a Titus in our life, a good friend whom we can trust, who won't abandon us, and would ease our burden when we are in need. And for us who are perhaps not facing sorrow, then we need to do this to others. In a world where we are becoming more individualistic, the world is lacking a good friend. Will you then be a Titus to someone, to a friend who is going through tough times, or perhaps a family member, your parents, your siblings, even your children? You see, this is our task now as Christians, to be God's representative in bringing comfort to those who are facing sorrows. And I think we all know that it is a challenge, for we know that we ourselves can face sorrows. There are times that we want to help, but we just can't because we ourselves need help. And if it is just one of us who is doing the help, then we will overburden ourselves as well. That is why we need a community. And this is my last point. For Paul, this community was briefly broken. Problem arose from the very community he loves. And that is why Paul sent Titus to correct the situation in Corinth. It was not to condemn them, but to make room for him in their hearts. Paul was like a loving father to them who speaks with great frankness and who takes great pride in them. Like a father, it pains the heart of Paul that the Corinthians, whom he loved so much, would oppose him and turn their back on him. But Like any good father, Paul wants to be reconciled with whom he considers as his children, the Corinthians. That is why it is with great joy that Paul would hear from Titus of the Corinthians longing for him, of their deep sorrow and concern for him. This really speaks of the Corinthians' reconciliation with Paul. And so this brought great joy to Paul. Like Paul, we also need a community that would long for us, who would have sorrow when we have been wronged and have deep concern for us. And as Christians, let us not be a community that turns our back on people, but instead pursue people, especially those whom we have wronged. Like the Corinthians, we can be a community humble enough to accept our mistakes when our actions have caused others to have sorrow. Now, for Paul, this was not a selfish joy. No? It's nice that people would long for you and would be concerned about you, but sometimes this can be very self-serving, right? But not Paul. You see, very typical of Paul, this joy was not that he just wants the Corinthians to do for himself, but for others as well. You see, this was Paul's mission. He wants the people not to be just reconciled to him, but more importantly, to God through Christ. Why? So that more and more people become like Christ. Paul wants a community that reflects Christ's humility and love, looking after the interests of others, especially those in need, like those who are depressed. Paul voices this out more intently in another letter that he has written, and this time to the Philippians. You know, in writing Philippians, Paul again finds himself depressed as he writes this letter. Scholar tells us that he writes Philippians as he languishes in jail, perhaps knowing that at any time he can be executed. And we can only imagine the sorrow Paul was facing as he wrote his letter. But despite this, he still found joy. Why? Because he has God. He has not just a friend, but many loyal friends and a community. And this already gives him joy. But now he has a request. Make my joy complete. How? By being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. As Christians, this is now our mission. Many have God in their life and have joy. But like Paul, they still experience sorrow, sometimes too much to bear that they become depressed. And this could be us. Let us then be a community that makes their joy complete and bring back the joy they once had by looking after their interests. Let us be that channel that brings God's love and comfort to them. We can do this, whether it is our community in CBSI, in our church, or among our friends, because this is the mission that we now have as followers of Christ. Now, this ends my talk, and I hope you were blessed by the message of Paul, his own message from his experience of how he was able to overcome the depression that perhaps he was facing at that time, all because he had God in his life, he had a friend, and he has a community. Let us be that community. Again, thank you and God bless.